Another example of free society is Donald Trump goes to the Ford plant today. I mean, I'm serious. This is what, and again, this isn't just some trivial thing. This is what the whole fight is about. Like, do we live in the kind of country where you can do this or not? And a worker screams at him and calls him a pedophile protector. And he flips the worker off before walking away. I think we have this footage. Play that for us. Someone screaming pedophile protector. Again, their whole thing is project strength, project popularity, only care about the base. But that's not the reality out in the world.
No, not at all. And I think at every turn, whether it's the Epstein scandal, the way ICE is behaving, Trump's economic policies, the actions of the administration betray a lack of discipline that I think people can really see. Phil and I were talking about this in the green room earlier. If you want to make the Epstein scandal go away, which it seems the Trump administration very much wants to do, the way you don't do that is flipping off someone who calls you a pedophile protector on camera. And it's just a sign that this administration, the same way the president can't help himself from getting in front of a camera and just crafting policy right off the bat, from screaming at reporters, the same way this administration is allowing ideological goons to join a Gestapo force with virtually no training, the way this administration is constantly trying to throw Band-Aids on top of mistake after mistake after mistake, those kinds of actions have consequences. And I think the American people, I think your 1776 comparison is particularly apt because as someone who grew up in a very conservative family, one of the core ideological principles of conservatives is the thing you need to be wary about is government repression.
Yes, exactly.
That one day the government will come for you.
And that Joe Rogan clip we played at the top, he's got a longer monologue where he says, like, this is kind of the nightmare, right? When people kind of do this. Philip Bump, Nikki McCameron, great to have you both here.
Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York. The fact that the criminal section of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, the very unit tasked with investigating killings by police, refused to investigate the deadly shooting by a federal agent of a woman in Minneapolis last week is so shocking that it has led to the largest mass resignation inside the Department of Justice in months. Our colleagues, Carol Lennick and Ken Delanium, were first to report this, quote, top leaders of the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division have left their jobs to register their frustration with the department after the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Harmeet Dillon, decided not to investigate the ICE officer's fatal shooting of Renee Good last week. When asked for comment, a DOJ official, quote, did not dispute the departures, but said the officials have requested early retirement prior to the Minnesota shooting. For years, the criminal section of the Civil Rights Unit has prosecuted major cases of police brutality, cases like the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. According to the section's own website, the ultimate goal of their work in every case is to, quote, ensure that allegations are thoroughly and fairly investigated, that acts constituting federal criminal civil rights violations are sufficiently remedied, and that the rights of the victims are vindicated. But now what the department is choosing to investigate is whether or not Renee Nicole Good had any ties to activist groups. According to the New York Times, quote, the decision by the FBI and Justice Department to scrutinize Ms. Good's activities and her potential connections to local activists is in line with the White House strategy of deflecting blame for the shooting away from federal law enforcement and toward opponents they have described as domestic terrorists, often without providing evidence. The handling of the investigation is also reportedly leading to turmoil inside the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota. From the New York Times reporting, quote, 6 federal prosecutors in Minnesota resigned Tuesday over the Justice Department's push to investigate the widow of a woman killed by an ICE agent and the department's reluctance to investigate the shooter. That is according to people with knowledge of their decisions. Joseph H. Thompson, who was second in command at the U.S. Attorney's Office, was among those who quit Tuesday, according to 3 people with knowledge of that decision. New York Times adding that Thompson rejected the idea of investigating Renee Nicole Good's widow, as well as, quote, the Justice Department's refusal to include state officials in investigating whether the shooting itself was lawful. People familiar with his decision say. Turmoil at the Justice Department in the wake of the shooting death of Renee Nicole Good by an ICE agent is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. MS Now senior investigative reporter who is bylined on that reporting that we led from at the DOJ. Carol Leonnig is back with us. She's also the author of the book Injustice: How Politics and Fear Vanquished America's Justice Department. Also joining us, former assistant special agent in charge at the FBI and MS Now national security and intelligence analyst Michael Feinberg's back. He's also a fellow at Lawfare, and former top official at the DOJ. Legal analyst Andrew Weissman is back with us as well. Carol Leonnig, take us through your reporting first, please.
Well, we thought it was pretty urgent last night at 10 o'clock when we learned and then confirmed that at least 4, and possibly now we've confirmed 6 as of this afternoon, senior leaders of the Civil Rights Division unit that handles this kind of investigation were resigning, partially in protest of how the department decided not to investigate the fatal shooting by an ICE officer of Renee Good. You know, you set it up perfectly when you described it, Nicole, as this is the unit that historically has always investigated these, not because there's a conclusion that an officer improperly drew his weapon or her weapon, but because there must be a fair investigation when an American citizen or civilian is killed by a federal officer. There is a belief, and there has been a belief in the Justice Department until now, that it's important for fairness and trust in the department that these investigations happen. We've also confirmed that good reporting by the Times that 6 federal prosecutors with the Department of Justice in the Minneapolis-based office of the U.S. Attorney's Office have resigned, furious that there would be no investigation of that shooting. There would be no allowing the local authorities to participate. And instead, there would be an emphasis on investigating Good and her widow. I guess what's most important for readers and viewers of this show to take away is that the sources who came to us to tell us about this are trying to send an alarm bell. They're trying to send a signal that what's happening in the Justice Department is not copacetic. This decision not to investigate the death of an American at the hands of an ICE officer is beyond the pale for a lot of these officials. They did register, by the way, the Civil Division folks who resigned, these leaders, they did register their concern that they were considering leaving before the shooting. But after the shooting, after the decision by their bosses not to investigate it, they all concluded they would leave immediately.
Carol, let me just make sure. So it's 12 prosecutors are out, have resigned over the Justice Department's handling. Let me ask you a dumb question. Isn't it bad for the ICE agent that he doesn't want the imprimatur of a thorough review of his conduct to clear him?
Well, I mean, it's not a dumb question at all, by the way, but it does presume that the officer acted as the standard requires, which is you only use lethal, deadly force when you have a reasonable belief that your life is in danger. And there's a serious question based on the video evidence about whether or not the officer actually thought his life was in danger. This was an officer who had a gun drawn. A wheel turned away from that individual. He shot her through the front windshield, but the corner of the windshield because he was at a corner from her. And he also had a phone in his hand because he had been filming the sort of events around that day, protesters of ICE officers in Minnesota's streets. And so it's a question that's reasonably raised. Did he have a reasonable basis to think his life was in danger if he shot her as she was turned away from him and if he had a phone in his hand?
Michael Feinberg, I guess it's a dumb question because, of course, they don't think an investigation would be good for this officer, or they would have one. I mean, as much as the Trump story rumbles and roars on like a freight train, there are some things that don't ever change. The worst thing in the world for ICE right now is for DOJ to not investigate the conduct of the officer. The worst thing in the world for Donald Trump is for ICE to be more unpopular than it is right now, dividing not just America, but his own coalition. The worst thing in the world for Stephen Miller is for more people inside Trump's coalition to think that he's out of control and dragging Donald Trump's popularity into the toilet bowl with the out-of-control conduct of ICE. And the worst thing for the Department of Justice, already on the ropes politically because of their laughable handling of the Epstein case, just ask Susie Wiles in her 11 on-the-record interviews, is for DOJ to look like they're in on this political debacle and a cover-up of an ICE agent. I mean, what is amazing is that the facts and the things that happen before our eyes are obviously the same facts and things that happen before the very eyes of Harmeet Dillon and other decision makers at DOJ.
Yeah, so first of all, this is a very short-sighted decision by people at the Justice Department who think they are actually helping Officer Ross. Because the fact is, if our Constitution and country function like they're supposed to, at some point this administration is going to end. But what is not going to end with it is the state statute of limitations for murder or manslaughter or whatever crime they may choose to charge Ross with in the future. And a thorough DOJ investigation, if it did in fact exonerate him, would go a very long way to creating at least an informal presumption of his relative innocence, if that were to be the case. But look, this is all of a piece of what we know about how the Trump administration operates. They shade the law and they obfuscate when their perceived allies are in trouble with prosecutors or with law enforcement. We saw it in the first term with the way Bill Barr horribly mischaracterized and underplayed the conclusions of Robert Mueller's final report, which Andrew worked on. We saw it during the campaign for the 2024 election when he promised to pardon thousands of people who committed an act of domestic terrorism and assaults on federal officers. Those pardons did in fact happen. We have seen it with an investigation into Tom Homan evaporating into thin air. And now we're seeing it with a refusal to even consider the possibility that Officer Ross and his colleagues may have been outside policy.
But Trump's motive here is simple. He wants to corrupt the Fed's independent process to basically give him MAGA markets. And so instead of looking out for all people in this country and what's best for the entire long-term economy, that's the Fed's job. That's why the law gives it power separate from the White House, just as judges don't report into the White House, whether Trump likes it or not. There are whole parts of the federal government specifically with their own powers because this isn't a unitary state. So instead of that, Trump wants the Fed to give him a short-term economic sugar rush to artificially boost him and his party, the Republican Party, for these upcoming elections. I'm going to walk through this with you, and I think we have some interesting stuff to show you, including across history in this report. But bottom line, it's about power. It's about MAGA markets trying to interfere with what otherwise would happen in the real economy and the real electorate. Now, we can get into some of the economic details, but for now, that's the gist. Having a politician control the central bank breaks the law. It shreds the central bank's freedom if he got away with it. It obviously undercuts free markets. And for all the valid criticism of Wall Street and today's markets, one thing that Bernie Sanders, liberals, and conservative Wall Street leaders agree on is that politicians should not have more corrupt power over the independent central bank. Now, politicos tend to focus on politics, which we could define as the candidates' strategies and pitches and their plans. Tonight, in our report, I want to broaden out, and some of this is, I think, just kind of interesting to look back over, because the iron law of elections across all history and geography in the modern era is the economy overrides everything. When the markets crash or times are tough, voters punish the party in power. Now, on the politics, you can actually measure voters' reaction to each of those crashes across decades of elections, in midterms and presidential years, angry voters will punish governments, the incumbents, over a bad economy. That is a truth that drives legendary political sayings that have become cliches, and many races you probably remember.
It's the economy, stupid.
America's wonderful, ain't it, Mr. Bush? Maybe you'll be unemployed.
We project that Bill Clinton is going to be the next president of the United States.
Obama blames Washington for the country's economic woes and is trying to link John McCain to President Bush's policies.
I had the honor of calling Senator Barack Obama to congratulate him.
The greatest economic year in the history of our country. You had 3 of them with me, and then we got hit with the plague.
Joe Biden is on track to be the next president.
A plague for people and markets. Biden's win was propelled by voters upset about the economy crushed by COVID. And some politicos might have overestimated what the voters were saying, as if it were an embrace of all Biden policies rather than concern about the crashing chart you see on the screen. And likewise, there are other politicos currently overestimating Trump's win just last year, which was also propelled by voters upset with high prices. The economy shapes elections more than anything else. History shows it. Political science shows it. And this isn't some new narrative that the media is just glomming onto during this new clash over the Fed this week. We report on this all the time in factual political coverage. Before the COVID crash, we reported how Trump was on track for re-election unless the economy fell. And then it did, and Biden beat him, as mentioned. And on 2024 election night, we were reporting on the trend of people voting against the incumbent party, the Democrats, because of high prices and economic concerns.
With the coronavirus that people are so scared about, how does that affect what's going on as far as with the Democrats, with Biden and even Trump?
During these kind of crises, especially if it gets worse, we'll see people tend to go, wait a minute, I need government. I think Donald Trump has a good path to re-election and a good economy.
He's probably going to
win. And maybe not in a bad economy.
When the economy is bad enough and that's front and center, people tend to vote against what they see as the incumbent party. In this case, you had an incumbent vice president. Is it that everyone gave Donald Trump a bigger hug because he closed so well? Or is it something we've seen from time going back to the beginning of elections that when people are mad about the economy, they vote against the incumbent? They vote against the incumbent. They vote against high prices. And in that case, they voted against the Biden-Harris administration. Now, no one can see the future, but history shows the trends. The president's party loses badly when the market crashes. Republicans actually gained a whopping 67 seats in the midterms after a post-war downturn. Democrats surged by over 60 seats in the recession of 58 and won 49 seats in 74 amid inflation that was so bad they called it stagflation, when high prices are worsened by job losses and negative growth. And that's just midterms, which is what Trump is bracing for in 10 months. Economic backlashes are even worse in presidential years. A lot more people vote. And here you've got some examples. Reagan won and the GOP gained 46 seats off that economic malaise I mentioned after a campaign where Reagan rattled off inflation data and his knowledge of the Federal Reserve. Notice that's back in the headlines now. He was doing it to pound Carter's economy.
To get a handle on inflation because in January, at the beginning of the year, it was more than 18%. Since then, he has blamed to the people for inflation OPEC. He's blamed the Federal Reserve System. He has blamed the lack of productivity of the American people. He has then accused the people of living too well.
That was then. And one of the most successful candidates in the modern era, Barack Obama, certainly won plenty of elections without riding a recession, but his biggest win, the first time he took the White House, we'll add to the chart, was when Democrats swept the White House, the House, and the Senate, with voters punishing the GOP for some of those clips I just played you earlier when Stephanie Ruhle was walking the carnage of the market floor, the housing crash, and what became the Great Recession. That's American politics, where we have elections every 2 years, whether the politicians like it or not. But as Donald Trump muses openly about a world without elections or where he has soldiers in the streets and unitary power, I would remind everyone that even autocrats abroad have seen that bad economies can topple their reign. Argentinian leader Perón was overthrown amid inflation and the economic problems in the 50s. Same story for Ferdinand Marcos and Mobutu Sese Seko. Rampant inflation drove the uprisings along with other factors. You can even go to the fall of Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. Of course, it was complicated, but it was the economic failure at home that weakened the dictator's control and created a more ripe environment for a protest movement where people risked their lives to ultimately topple the government. History shows why Trump's fixated on crushing Fed independence to control the economy right now, even as there's so much else going on. And he's doing it even if it angers powerful Republicans on Wall Street and brings the clash all the way up to the Supreme Court next week. So history has something to teach us, as well as how to win for those looking at democracy versus whatever autocracy others are pitching. Now, Trump and Republicans control the White House and Congress right now. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but I'll tell you a couple things. They could pass laws to better regulate AI. They could tax just those richest companies for emergency bailout funds so that if we do face a crash, it's those companies on the hook for their bets instead of the predictable pattern of bailouts tapping working people and people who weren't even in the stock market. They could do that right now. You could literally put that fund aside, break the glass if they need it, and if they never need it, do whatever with it, or even yield some of it back to them. Republicans could regulate crypto to contain what is an obvious risk. Donald Trump once publicly called it a scam. But they're not doing that. They're not doing long-term economic policy work to benefit the general public. If that sounds like a criticism or an indictment, well, it is the fact, and I've shown you all of the receipts. Do with that fact what you will. Instead, Donald Trump takes what he once called a scam of crypto and is grifting hundreds of millions of dollars off that industry in his own let-them-eat crypto moment while people struggle to get by. Trump has shown he'd rather risk breaking the law, maybe even losing at the Supreme Court. He'd rather do that to cover his tracks with some short-term economic sugar high if he can get away with it. And Donald Trump knows all about the economy shaping elections. He was obsessed with that very political problem when COVID was tanking the markets. He knew it was a risk for him. He understood that math. At times, and Bob Woodward and others have told us about this and have recorded calls from the period where Trump was as concerned about the markets and the perception of the economy as he was about who was dying of COVID. And then he came back into office running against Biden on the high prices complaint. So now he wakes up every day fearing a midterm rout that could seal his lame duck fate at a time when Republicans have already voted him down on Congress, on Epstein, on health care last week. They're even planning a vote on the war powers that he's trying to use as his domestic powers clearly wane. Losing the midterms, which Trump's own RNC chair says is likely, would obviously hasten his political demise. It could also bring on more accountability. If Democrats are in the House, we have some memory of what that was like in the first term, the subpoenas, the probes, and if there is constitutional violations, maybe another impeachment. Maybe even one over pocketing foreign jets and hundreds of millions in crypto. Constitution says you can't take foreign gifts. He's been taking tons of them that we know of. Trump did not leave peacefully after his last loss either. So everyone must be ready for a sequel, a reboot, or a more extreme version if Republicans lose in 28 of the January 6th violence that Trump now backs and pardoned. So history can be grim, but it has lessons, and it shows clearly how economic unrest, the lived reality of the mass public, can, abroad and at home, congeal with informed protest for revolutions in any system of government that bring the power back to the people. It is those dynamics that have dislodged so many incumbents, even powerful ones, and even those who have very clearly shown they would end democracy if they could.
The New York Times has potentially significant new reporting on the type of aircraft the Pentagon used in its first strikes on Caribbean boats back in September, details that could be considered a war crime. According to the Times, citing officials briefed on the matter, the plane used in the strike was mocked up to look like a civilian aircraft, possibly causing those on board the vessel to drop their guard before the attack. 11 people were killed in the strike. Joining us, New York Times Washington correspondent Charlie Savage. So, Charlie, walk us through your reporting.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. So we're familiar with how the first boat attack back in September has attracted a lot of controversy, including because there was a follow-up strike that killed the initial survivors. And the context to this is that a lot of people outside the government think that all of these attacks have been illegal. Every killing has been a murder. The Trump administration has argued that they're lawful because Trump says there's an armed conflict between the United States and drug cartels. And even if you take that at face value, killing follow-up initial survivors who have been shipwrecked would be a war crime under the laws of armed conflict. What's new here is a second layer to that, which is it turns out that the aircraft the United States military used to carry out the attacks on that boat was not visibly military. It looked like a civilian plane. It was painted in a way that was not military, did not have military insignia on it. It carried its weapons inside the fuselage rather than under its wings. And it apparently got low enough that the people on the boat could see it. And so there is a war crime under the laws of armed conflict called perfidy, which is basically treacherous killing. And it says that you cannot feign protected status, like being a civilian, in a way that gets the adversary to drop its guard and then attack them. And usually that's in the context of not them first attacking you, but there's other ways in which they could drop their guard, such as not taking evasive action or not knowing that they ought to surrender because a warcraft is coming at them. And so there's been, it turns out, behind closed doors inside the Pentagon and in the deliberations between Congress and the executive branch since the oversight effort began, in addition to all the questions about attacking shipwrecked survivors and whether that was a war crime, there's been this whole other conversation we did not know about, which was the use of this airplane painted in a way that made it look like a civilian aircraft a war crime to attack these people perfidiously?
Charlie, the Pentagon says they were acting under all legal protocol. I'm curious, is it often that we have aircraft that is mocked up to look like this and which holds weapons that are hidden in the fuselage? If that is something that's against the law, it could be considered a war crime. Why do we have that in our arsenal?
So there's definitely a few planes that look like civilian aircraft. They're derivative of, for example, a Cessna. There's one that's a derivative of a 737 Boeing jet that the United States military uses. Usually those are painted gray, and they say things like U.S. Navy. The P-8 Poseidon the Navy has, for example, are 737s. But we know that there are some that are basically white, or they have like a blue stripe, but there's no military insignia on it. There's not that circle with the star, they call that a rondelle, that says this is a military plane. As far as I can tell, talking to law of war experts, the mere existence of these aircraft in the arsenal is not a war crime or a conspiracy to war crime because there are applications in which it would be lawful. You can, for example, transport things on a plane without saying that it's military. You might, in a hostage rescue situation, not want to advertise that you're military. But things change when it's used for an offensive attack. You cannot, under the laws of armed conflict, as a lawful combatant, conceal the fact that you're a combatant and then attack after inducing reliance on your adversary into thinking that you're actually a civilian. It's the use of something like this in an attack that makes a difference.
Yeah, really interesting. Charlie Savage, thank you very much. And joining us now, former Deputy Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Air Force, Major General Stephen Lepper. General, thank you for joining us. What do you think of what Charlie just reported?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Well, Charlie just did my job for me. He did an excellent job describing what the laws of armed conflict say in a situation like this.
The mere existence of these planes, as Charlie was reporting, that doesn't seem to be the issue here. Why, if the Pentagon, if it's against protocol, if it's against the laws of combat, why would the Pentagon, can you find a justification for the Pentagon doing this and using it in this manner to strike Caribbean alleged drug boats?
No, as Charlie said, there are aircraft in the military inventory that are not marked as military aircraft. But those are aircraft that are typically not engaged in dropping weapons. Matter of fact, they're not armed at all. And in this particular case, when Charlie talks about perfidy, when the law talks about perfidy, what perfidy really means is that they are acts that are committed in order to basically, the act would be to feign or imitate a medical aircraft or in this case, a civilian aircraft, so that they could gain advantage over the enemy. And when the military aircraft that are not painted as military aircraft are usually employed in military operations, they are not in a situation where they're dropping bombs. And more importantly here, the key fact here that Charlie reported was that this aircraft was visible. And in order for perfidy to exist, you have to have an intent to deceive. And you also have to have a situation where the people you're trying to deceive are in a position where they can rely on the deception. Normally, these aircraft fly at 30,000 feet, and you can't see them or how they're painted from the ground. In this particular case, if the aircraft flew close enough to the survivors so that they could either do something or not do something that would have put them in a more advantageous position because they thought this was a civilian aircraft, then those are the requirements of perfidy, and it seems that they existed in this case.
So last month there was a lot of drama around Senator Mark Kelly and others in Congress releasing a video that said, as a service member, you have a duty to refuse illegal orders. Would this be an illegal order if somebody was telling you to fly this plane or this drone that is mocked up to look like a civilian aircraft and to fly it visibly and then to strike? Would that just be a open and shut, closed case of an illegal order that the person who was operating it should have refused?
I would say it very well could be. In the situation with an aircraft described the way Charlie did, there are two ways to identify the aircraft. One is through its transponder. The transponder is basically an electronic emitter that identifies a certain code that is reserved for the military. And if another aircraft that has a transponder or a ground station or someone that has a transponder hears the code, they'll know it's a military aircraft. The second is how it's painted. And in this particular case, the crew flying at an altitude where the aircraft couldn't be seen may very well have been able to drop weapons on their target because the fact that their paint job wasn't military was not a factor. In this case, if the aircraft got close enough so that the survivors saw the paint job, then I would say that they've now crossed over into a situation where what they are doing is illegal. And in order to do that would have been an unlawful order.
All right, General, thank you very much for joining us. Major General Stephen Lepper, I appreciate it, sir.
Joining us now, the sponsor of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which created that deadline, Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna. He is a member of the House Oversight Committee.
Congressman, welcome to the table. So we all know we have a very, in my estimation, a very underdeveloped man sitting in the White House. And he is not, in my view, that was just a punkish move. I don't know who he thinks he was impressing. I guess it's more impressive as the President of the United States flips you off. But put your big boy pants on, Mr. President. The country's a big country, and we have opinions. We have opinions about you. We have opinions about your actions. So that's all I want to say about that. The fact that the White House, response was a lunatic was wildly screaming expletives in a complete fit of rage. Their over-dramatization of stuff is another bit of crap we have to put up with. So I just want to get your reaction. That was mine.
Yeah.
I want to get yours.
Well, underdeveloped is pretty gracious for the new year. That's
it is.
That's
my daddy's teaching me how to do these things right. So.
Look, it's not a coincidence of what sets him off. What set him off is the heckler saying you're a pedophile protector. I was just on a podcast with Sean Ryan. Sean Ryan's the #2 podcaster in the country. He was all in on Trump. and he said what lost Trump is protecting pedophiles. That's what this Epstein issue is about. It has gotten under his skin because he knows he's losing the MAGA base on this. He was elected to expose the corruption, to hold these people accountable. Instead, every move they made is to protect people who raped underage girls. And now you have today a federal judge who responded to Massey and my motion, quite a breakthrough, where he's now ordered the Department of Justice to brief him on whether he should appoint a special master to actually get these documents released.
The fact that that happened today at a Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan, while the president was on a factory tour with the CEO of Ford at the end of the manager of the plant, I think speaks to the fact that this is broken through in ways that I don't think anyone would have imagined last year when this first happened. Let's read a little from this, what the judge said, to your point. In a letter to the judge, Khanna and Massey wrote that they believe the criminal violations have taken place and must be addressed, but first they hope federal courts will step in and force the Department of Justice to follow the law. Are you optimistic that the courts are going to step in quickly? Because I think they'll step in. How quickly will they do so?
Well, we filed a letter yesterday, and the judge issued the order this morning. A lot of times, judges, when you file an amicus friend of the court intervention, just ignore it. Not only did the judge decisively order it, he's ordered briefings by January 20th, and he wants to know, why is the DOJ think that they're going to release these files and comply with the law? Should he appoint a special master to ensure that compliance? And, you know, the important thing is, what are the documents we want? We want the survivors' testimony to the FBI agents where they name the other pedophiles, where they name the other men who abused young girls. That's what we want. They haven't released a single one. So even the judge ordering that those documents need to come out will be a big deal. But, you know, your point about this breaking through, it's broken through, and it's broken through with men, and it's broken through with MAGA men. And that's why it doesn't surprise me on the factory floor. And it's a huge issue for this president.
I also think what is happening in Minnesota is breaking through with a lot of people, in part because there are so many onlookers who are managing to take videos as these incidents happen. And so all across this country, we are watching what is happening in Minneapolis. I'm not sure if you saw this video. It was a man named Christian Molina, a U.S. citizen. He said he was driving to a mechanic on Monday. Agents in another vehicle followed him, even turned on their siren. He said his rear bumper was hit by those agents as he turned a corner. He refused to produce identification for those agents, saying he wanted to wait for local police. Let's watch some of this exchange and then talk about it on the other side.
See what you did to my car?
Yeah, you broke in front of me.
No, I didn't.
These are the tense moments in the streets of Minneapolis after Christian Molina, an American citizen, says an ICE agent rammed into his car.
I don't need to show you anything. I don't need to show you anything.
If you're innocent, why did you ram?
The Ecuadorian American says he was just driving around when he was racially profiled by ICE. Why do you think they stopped you?
Because I look Latino, I'm brown, and I got mustache. I don't know. There's no reason for that. They only looked at me and they just trying to follow me for no reason.
Racial profiling, which I will say was sanctioned by the U.S. Supreme Court. My question for you, given the success you have had in building a bipartisan coalition around the release of the Epstein files, are there lessons from that organizing that can apply to the conversation that Democrats are now having around needing to rein in ICE, rein in DHS, the way in which this president is going after the Fed? Where do you see opportunities for Republicans to get on board and actually hold this administration accountable?
You're right, because it's about huge government overreach. And even Joe Rogan today was railing against ICE agents, saying in this country, you can't have masked ICE agents go shoot people. I mean, you look at that video with the 37-year-old mother, and you know that agent could have done a lot of things short of shooting her and killing her. And so I believe that when you frame this as an issue of excessive force, civil liberties, freedoms, people, even Republicans, are concerned. And those Kavanaugh stops are horrible.
I agree with you that the constituents are there. Do you get a sense, though, that the people you work with in your chamber, the Republicans in your chamber, are there?
I get a sense that more of them are willing to speak up. I was just talking to Leader Jeffries today.
I was about to say, not Mike Johnson. He's speaking up.
But look, Leader Jeffries made an incredible, important point. It wasn't just the Epstein discharge petition that passed. We had a discharge petition that passed to protect workers, and we had the discharge petition passed to extend the health care tax credits. He said in the last 30 years, you've not had that many discharge petitions passed. There are so many discharge petitions floating in the House of Representatives. Johnson has lost control of the House. The president is losing control of the caucus. And this is because more people are saying they see his poll numbers. They see his losing support of the podcasters and of some of his base. And they're saying there's going to be life after Trump. Do I want to survive politically?
Yeah, go ahead, Simone. Look, from my perspective,
say it, sir.
I just want to put a statement on the table. Congressman, I think you are at a tipping point as a member of the House. I think your caucus is at a tipping point. This country is tipped. We have an individual in the White House who's unfit to be there. It's not my proof. It's the TMZ evidence. It's what's happening on the streets of Minnesota, what happened in the streets right here where I grew up in Washington, D.C. Your leadership means more now than at any point in the history of this country. Why? Because we are leaderless by the men who are in charge. So what Alicia asked you, what Simone has put on the stage, those are questions that reflect an anxiety across the country, not just in little pockets where Democrats have tea, not just in little pockets where former and current Republicans like myself are sitting there wringing their hands. We're looking for people who are in the job, who have the title. I'm not looking at the men and women who sit in that Capitol with an R behind their name because they're bought and paid for by Donald Trump. They're wholly owned. And even when they do break their silence, it's limited. It's when they're on their way out the door. It's when they're going to stay in the shadows and peek around and not admit the man behind the curtain is the one who's manipulating things. So, sir, help us move to the next point, because that's what's required right now. We can't trust anybody else, whether it's Jeffries or... The process doesn't work, sir. Stop playing the process game. It is where you're going to show fight on behalf of the American people. That's what this November is about, and that's why Donald Trump wants to interrupt this election, because he knows damn well what lies ahead for him is not good if the American people get their way.
Well, I have a thought, but I feel like you should respond.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's the time for boldness. I mean, that was what the Epstein fight was about. That's what my call to arrest the ICE officer and prosecute him was about. That is what those of us who have called to not have regime change war in Venezuela is about, and to make sure that he doesn't start bombing Iran and bombing Greenland and bombing and taking over Cuba, that we actually stand up to a president who wants to have regime change wars across the country. That's what those of us who believe that there should be prosecution for every single person in the Trump administration who's violated the law when we have a Democratic president, that we're not going to have reconciliation without justice and accountability, and that we need to keep a list of people who are violating the law, because there is not going to be impunity. There is a new courage in the Democratic caucus. I see this. We may not have been there a year ago. We are there now. There is a new step. There is a new boldness. And it's not just about procedure. It's about moral clarity.
I know we have to go, but
ahead.
Part of that moral clarity, would you support impeachment if Democrats take back the House? Because on the list of criminals and offenses, if many of the things we've seen over the last year from the president are not impeachable offenses, I'm unsure about what is.
Yes, I do. And look, I know people say, oh, it's a distraction. That's what they said about Epstein when I started. Oh, it's a distraction. Let's talk about the cost of rent and the cost of food. You can do both.